In this video, I'm going to be talking to you about the Egyptian Book of the Dead. This is a component of their beliefs in the afterlife. The Book of the Dead is one of the most interesting artifacts from ancient Egypt that we still have today. And in fact, I should really be talking about multiple books of the dead, in that just about every person who died would have had a Book of the Dead, which was in the form of a scroll that they were usually buried with. Um, so, in general, a Book of the Dead is fairly common in many different cultures. Um, in Egypt, the Book of the Dead really focused on three main things. One was a set of rituals that needed to be performed at the death of a person. So these are religious rituals, prayer rituals, things to say, ornaments to include in burial, right? Just kind of basic funerary texts, right? Like what to do when someone dies. The second thing that the Book of the Dead shows us is what the Egyptians believed happened in the afterlife, what the soul's journey was from the moment of death until hopefully the arrival in the afterlife. Um, and that's what I'm going to walk you through in this video now. The third component, which we'll talk about later, is how to mummify a body. That the mummification process is detailed in the Egyptian Book of the Dead. So let's start by looking at the image that's on the screen. You'll notice a few things about this image. You'll notice a number of people, some animals, and a lot of writing, right? A lot of hieroglyphic writing. Um, this is pretty standard of an Egyptian Book of the Dead. This is kind of what they all typically look like. So what you have here on the screen, let me get my mouse over there, is this individual up here is actually the deceased. He is the person who is passed, and this is his soul. This is representing his, his immortal self, if you will. Well, hopefully immortal self, and kind of overseeing the process that's happening down in this area here. You'll notice that there are a number of individuals here. First, you have most notably, right, you have the dead body, right? This is the mummified body with the sarcophagus on top, the kind of head covering that they would place on top of a mummified body. Here you have a person wearing a jackal head mask, which, if you remember from your Egyptian gods assignments, right, the jackal-headed god is the god Anubis, who is the god of the dead, is one of the gods of the dead, specifically about mummification and the funerary rites, right, the rites that go along with a funeral. We'll talk about how to distinguish a priest of Anubis and Anubis himself in the next slide. But it's also important to realize the connection between Egyptian gods and the animals that they represent. In this case, Anubis being a jackal. Jackals, if you don't know, are scavengers. They eat dead things. So it makes sense that the Egyptians would use a jackal as an animal of the dead, specifically an animal or a god devoted to the body, the deceased body of an individual. So, right, there's some connections with observation of the material world in their religious outlooks. Okay, let's get to the people in this image, because there's a lot happening here. So you have the priest who's holding up the body. You have women, family members of the deceased, kind of lamenting and praying over the dead body. Right, they're kind of showing their grief. They're saying certain prayers. All of this is outlined in the text, by the way, of the Book of the Dead. You have other priests or servants conducting other rituals, anointing, special perfumes, a lot of other things that are happening kind of over here, preparing the body again in terms of what's going to happen next, in terms of being laid to rest. Down here, there's another sequence happening where you have a cow and a calf, right? A baby cow. And if you look closely, you can see that the baby cow is missing a leg, and that's because they are about to sacrifice that leg over here in a burnt offering for the gods. All of this is basically to please the gods in the afterlife, is to basically give the person who died, um, for lack of a better word, special powers in the afterlife. They are, the way I like to think of it is, it's like a video game. They need to have certain attributes in order to get to the next level. And as we'll see, the Egyptian afterlife is basically a series of levels that have to be completed. Different tasks that happen at each one. First, starting with crossing the river into the underworld, which is what this guy's about to do up here. Before we move on, I should highlight the fact that this headstone looking thing is in fact that this body will be laid to rest inside this tomb here. If you're wondering how would this image fit inside this thing and why is this headstone so much bigger than the opening, remember, in the ancient world they didn't know about linear perspective, so they just made more important things bigger, or in this case they wanted to make sure that the inscription was large enough so it could be read. Right, so they made the headstone larger so that you could fit all the words that were necessary to be read. So let's follow our deceased friend up here to the next stage of to one of the next stages of the afterlife. So there's twists and turns that the person has to avoid, traps, and basically make their way through kind of like a video game, like a different levels, until they finally reach what's essentially called the Hall of Assessors. So at the top here, right here, he is again, and there are a number of gods, pharaohs, and family members who sit in judgment of the deceased. And basically, they have to convince them that they are worthy to make it to the afterlife, because not everyone does. If you don't make it to the afterlife, you just die. Your soul is destroyed, which we'll talk about how that works in a second. And you are, you move on, or you don't move on. You just cease to exist. So here we have a number of different people. I'll highlight a couple things. We can tell which ones are gods versus which ones are family members or pharaohs by the presence of the Ankh. Remember, that is this symbol here that these individuals have first in line, right? Gods go first. And anytime you see the Ankh in Egyptian mythology, that always symbolizes a god, right? They're usually shown carrying it, to symbolize the fact that they are in possession of eternal life, right? That they don't die, since the Ankh is the Egyptian symbol of life. So you have these people here. You have other pharaohs. You can tell that those are pharaohs by the beards that they have, right? That these are pharaohs here who had since lived, and these hieroglyphs are naming them. So you can see that there's a number of people that they have to basically convince that they are worthy to make it to the next step. If they're successful, that next step the soul joins the god Anubis. This is now the god. See, he's holding an ankh there, and his heart is weighed against a feather. Now, this isn't any ordinary feather. This is the feather of Maat, which, if you remember from our notes earlier, symbolizes truth and balance in Egyptian society. Remember that everything in Egyptian society was all about balance and maintaining order, right? The balance and order of things. So Maat was the goddess of this idea, and she lends her feather to this ceremony. In the ceremony, the person's heart is weighed against it. If the heart weighs more than the feather, then the person is seen as having lived a bad life, right? That their heart is, in our language, maybe weighed down with sin, and is therefore unacceptable to make it to the next stage. If, however, the feather is heavier, the person is said to have lived a good life and that they are now able to move on. If the person if the heart is heavier, then we have the heart being fed. The heart is where the Egyptians believe the soul resided. So the heart is the person's soul. So if it is heavier, which it's not in this image, but if it were heavier, it would be fed to this beast here called Ammit, which is half crocodile, half leopard, half hippopotamus. That it's basically the three most feared animals in ancient Egypt together as one, right? Most feared image that you can imagine. So this beast eats the heart. If they're bad, if they're good, they are then brought by Horus. This is what's happening here, to meet the main god of the dead, Osiris. He's the god who rules the underworld. Along the way, you have the god Thoth, who's if you remember from your research again, as the head of an ibis, which looks like the quill of a pen used in writing. So, and ibises are known to be on papyrus reeds, which also are where the Egyptians got their paper. So, makes sense that then Thoth is the creator of hieroglyphics, right? That he is the god of writing and knowledge. So Thoth records what happened, just for posterity's sake. Horus, the god, shows the deceased to Osiris, who's sitting here. You can tell that this is Osiris. One, because he's wearing the crown of Egypt. Remember, he used to be the ruler of the gods, along with the crook and the flail, right? Which we've talked so much about. And you can also tell that he's dead because he's green. As the story goes, Osiris was killed and tricked into being killed by Seth, who then chopped up his body and spread his body all throughout Egypt. His wife slash sister Isis, this is Osiris's wife slash sister Isis, went around and put all of his body back together again, and that then rejuvenated Osiris, since Isis is the goddess of magic, and then allowed him to basically rule the underworld. Since he was no longer alive, he wasn't permitted to rule above ground. So he's ruling the underworld, and this is the final step. If Osiris gives the okay, then you're in. You've made it to the afterlife. And the Egyptian afterlife was pretty simple. You worked on a farm growing wheat forever with your friends and family. That was what you did. I kind of like this, right? People need something to do. I've always found that if we have a long stretch, or if we have a long winter break or a number of snow days in a row, right, I kind of get bored by the fourth day off in a row without something to do. So, the Egyptians believed that people needed work, so they worked on a farm for all eternity. And that's really the Egyptian view of the afterlife. It was pleasant. It was very nice. There wasn't hardship or strife or anger or anything. You were just reunited with your deceased loved ones, and you got to spend eternity with them, farming for your food, every day that you needed. So that's the process of the Egyptian Book of the Dead. That's how we know about their afterlife. That's how we know what they believed happened in the soul's journey after they died. And in the next video, we're going to talk about the two other aspects of Egyptian culture that we've yet to talk about. One is mummification, and two is hieroglyphics, how we're able to actually read all of the stuff that's written down there and know what's really happening. So that's it for this video. Please, make sure you watch the next one, and let me know if you have any questions. I'll see you guys soon.